It's now my pleasure to welcome onto the stage David Burton from Daden Limited, and I'm told that in Dutch, Daden means deeds in the sense of deeds, not words. I think we're going to be hearing about both deeds and words, given the nature of conversational chatbots. David, please, the stage is yours. Thanks very much.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for braving the weather and coming out here. I want to give you, first of all, a sort of brief bit of background to the sorts of work we've been doing in the past, then talk particularly about the work we've been doing with MoD around conversational AI, and then finish off with where we think some of that might be leading. Certainly some of the work I'm going to talk about, you can see there's a number of different universities, different other organisations who are partner companies in some of the research that I'm going to be talking about. So who are we? We've been going since 2004. I've been involved in chatbots since long before that. Almost all we've done since 2004 is work within conversational AI and within virtual environments, creating training applications typically, but also a variety of other different things. We've picked up various awards on both sides of the Atlantic for the work that we've been doing inside of virtual spaces. And we do a lot of work that is R&D funded by organisations like MoD, by Innovate UK, and other organisations. So we're very much a sort of innovation-led, research-led company. We keep on thinking we really ought to rebrand as a charity, quite honestly. So, as I say, I got involved in chatbots myself back in the 1990s, so we were sort of well placed when we had the first chatbot boom around the sort of the mid-2000s. And so we got involved in developing a number of chatbots for a variety of different clients. We got one there from a housing association. We did several virtual librarians. We did a virtual newsreader. We worked on a project for visually impaired users to help them read their way through the internet. We created virtual characters within virtual environments that would act as things like tour guides or as greeters within different environments. So we did a lot of work during that period creating chatbot applications based fundamentally around something called artificial intelligence markup language, AI/ML, and then growing on from that. But then probably about 2009, 2010, everything sort of started to go quiet. Everybody started to move away from chatbots. I think a lot of people felt they weren't living up to their early promise. But we were still interested in the technology. So what we did is we sort of said, well, okay, let's go back to some of the basic research. Let's try and understand a bit better what is happening in the interaction between the user and the chatbot. One of the areas we looked at is this thing called anonymous intimacy, which is that when people are talking to a chatbot, it feels like it's actually quite an intimate one-to-one conversation, but at the same time it feels quite anonymous because, well, I'm just talking to a chatbot, aren't I? And the chatbot's not judging me in terms of what I'm doing. And so the evidence suggested, and some of the research that we did running a variety of evaluations, showed that actually people will often reveal more or declare more when they're talking to a chatbot than they would do if they were either talking to a human or filling out a form. One of the other things we were interested in was the Turing Test. I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of a Turing Test. One of the problems that we identified, along with many other people back in 2009, was that the Turing Test is really flawed in the sense, quite apart from whether it's not a measure of intelligence, just in terms of a measure of a chatbot, it's flawed. Because the problem is that the judge know that they're taking part in a Turing test. So they know that one of the two things they're talking to is a computer, one is a human. The hidden human knows they're taking part in a Turing test. So often you'll find I've been a hidden human in a Turing test. The hidden humans will try and outcompete each other to seem as robotic as they possibly can be. The only thing that doesn't know it's in a Turing test is actually the poor old chatbot. So what we said is what you need to do is you need to run what's called a covert Turing test or a hidden Turing test, which is where you run the Turing test, but you don't tell anybody that you're doing it. Now, that means you've got to have a certain level of deception, so you've got to make sure you get the right ethical clearances to go ahead and do it. But we've now been involved in running 2 of those covert Turing tests. The first one took place in the virtual world of Second Life, where people were invited in to a shop in Second Life. There was an avatar in there run by somebody who would then show them around the shop, take questions on it. They were looking at sort of new design ideas and things like that. They were in there for about 5 or 10 minutes. At the end, they filled out an interview survey questionnaire. All of the questions on it were totally meaningless because they were things like, did you actually like the shop? The very last question was, do you think the avatar was being run by a man or a woman or a computer? 78% of people were fooled into thinking that avatar was being run by either a man or a woman, not being run by a computer. So they, as judges, didn't know they were taking part in the Turing test until the very end. And even the virtual human, so we alternated whether the avatar was being run by a robot or by a computer or by a human, even the human that was taking part and driving the avatar, they also didn't know why they were doing it. They were just told, can you basically go in and man the shop for an hour or so. The second covert Turing we did with University of Worcester, funded by DSTL, so Defence Science Technology Lab, what we did there is we did a group covert Turing test. So we set up a rationale for the students that they were going in after hours to do some extracurricular work on something called problem-based learning. They were going to have 3 one-hour discussion groups between themselves and students from another university. And basically on the Monday night, they had an hour discussing a topic they were given. They were then told to go away and research, discuss again on the Wednesday night, and then come back on the Friday for a final discussion. Each one 1 hour, and each one with a human moderator, and typically about 3 or 4 students in it. In every single group, we put a chatbot. We didn't tell anybody apart from the moderator. Again, when we then interviewed people afterwards, not a single person out of all of the students that took part in the experiment said there was a chatbot in the room. What was interesting was some people talking about the chatbot said, well, he was a bit of a git, wasn't he? But quite honestly, if I can create a virtual git, that's a measure of success. Some people attributed it to possibly English not being a first language, possibly with some learning difficulties or something like that. But the overall sort of bounds of performance of the chatbot was within what people considered as being human. So doing some of this fundamental research again for us was actually quite useful and a good thing to do. Before I just move on to the main projects, I just want to give you our view about the AI landscape, because AI, as this conference shows, gets applied to almost everything nowadays. And what we found is quite useful is this sort of classic sort of 2x2 type matrix. Along the bottom here, we've got the complexity of the software. Are we talking about simple algorithms? Are we talking about complex algorithms, the sort of things you might use in a machine learning app? Are we talking about artificial general intelligence, or are we talking about something you might even describe as being sentient? And up the side there, we've got actually how is the program presenting itself as? Is it presenting itself as being just a computer, you're just filling out forms, or using a command line interface, or is it trying to present itself as human? And that could be in a whole variety of different aspects. That could be in terms of how it's speaking, how it's looking, what sort of emotional behaviours it's showing. And then basically on that grid, we can then plot, here's the science fiction AI. You ask the man or woman in the street what they think of as AI, and they'll come back with things like Channel 4's Humans, they'll talk about Skynet, they'll talk about things which are right over this side of the chart. You've got things like Siri and Alexa, which are not particularly sophisticated algorithms, but they're trying to present as being a human interface. You've got the machine learning type of activity that's not trying to necessarily present itself as human at all, but is very complex. And what we find at the moment is marketing appears to apply the term AI to a huge raft of different sorts of technologies, which are actually quite a long way away from what the man or woman in the street might regard as AI. And our work is very much in that sort of space. We're not looking at massively complex algorithms. We're trying to write actually as simple algorithms as we possibly can do, but using those to then try and create an experience which is as human as we can get to. And then within that chart, one of the things we've identified, and there's a blog post on it, and I'll talk about the book at the end, is basically 3 big challenges that certainly the human AI, whatever you want to call it, embodied AI type industry has got to face. The first one, which is probably the easiest, is actually how do we make that computer system seem more human? How is this conversation more human? How is the visuals more human? How is the audio more human? The second challenge, which is probably an order of magnitude bigger, if not 2 orders of magnitude, is how do we go from the sort of software we've got at the moment to something which is general purpose, and how do we create that artificial general intelligence? And then the third step, again, another couple of magnitudes greater and possibly even impossible, is how do we create something that actually appears to have sentience, and something which you would just be able to talk to and just say, well, that just seems human, for want of a better term. But we found this is a useful to situate the sort of things we're talking about, and certainly whenever anybody else says AI to us, then that's the chart we go to. Okay, so I want to move on now to talk about the work we've done with MoD. And there's 3 main areas that we've been looking at with them. First of all, with desk-based research, then moving into prototyping and actually deploying and actually getting soldiers, sailors, airmen and women to actually try this stuff out. The first one is the idea about virtual tutors. That's certainly a fairly common application you'll see in a lot of other areas. The idea about creating a bot that can actually help students through material. Obviously, the military faces issues worse than probably a lot of other organisations in terms of trying to bring people together, bring them into a central site. You've got a lot of people deployed on ships, deployed into different bases around the place. So if we can deliver as much of that learning as possible remotely, then that helps. Or even if we can just prepare them before they actually return to base to do the human-type training. Or can we use the virtual tutors in a flipped classroom-type model, where the virtual tutor goes through the mechanical side of what needs to be learnt, and then when they have a human-type session, then that can explore all the issues and be a far more interactive session. So that's one area. Quite honestly, there's a lot of that happening within sort of Civvy Street anyway, so it's not an area that in the end we've majored on with MoD. We've focused on the second two. So the first one is this idea of virtual mentors or virtual life coaches. And the basic question there is, could we give an app to a servicewoman when she first joins one of the services that basically will help her through the whole of her career, on into retirement, and basically all the way to when she's drawing her pension? And can that help at a whole variety of different levels? Can it help with what she needs day to day in terms of just managing family life, managing personal life, building resilience, just giving her access to information, access to basic services, not trying to look at her technical job, but looking at what she needs to do just to exist on a day-to-day basis. And it's often been referred to as friction. So can we create an app that basically just reduces the friction of doing your job, handles a lot of the more routine stuff? But one thing in particular is, as well as that sort of reactive role, can that same application take on a more proactive role? So at the moment, you get separate apps for things like mindfulness and well-being, but they are separate apps. And certainly whenever I've tried to use them, they basically end up nagging me and saying, you haven't talked to me for ages, please come and talk to me. Whereas actually, if I've got an app that I'm using on a day-to-day basis anyway, it's very simple for that app just to slot in the odd question about, actually, how did you sleep last night? How are you feeling? Are you feeling stressed at the moment? Do you know what's going on? And then actually react proactively, trying to understand the person's state, and then direct them towards the right sort of material to grow resilience, get access to more information, or whatever else it is. And then the third one is around the virtual persona. And we were fairly bold, I think, with this, because we said to MoD, what we want to do is try and make a copy of a person. Because the MoD suffers from the situation that a lot of people are on 2-year tours. So they go into a role, they do it for 2 years, and then they can be posted to the other side of the world. So there's a lot of corporate knowledge that disappears or moves around the organisation. People typically retire at 55. So again, or they're on short service commissions, which are only 3 years. So you've got a lot of information that's leaving the organisation very quickly. So what we said, wouldn't it be nice if you actually took a person whilst they're in service, that you built up a persona, a copy of that person, so that when that person leaves or gets posted, you've basically got a virtual copy. And it's like having somebody, like having the past on speed dial is basically how we described it. You could just have a Skype chat with a person who's just left the post. And what we said to them is, if we do this, we're going to do it really, really badly, because the technology won't currently let us do it really, really well. But only by trying to do it and doing it badly will we get a sense of where the gaps are and where we need to focus work in the future. But more importantly, it'll also help to surface some of the ethical issues and the moral issues that come around this sort of technology. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about both of those two projects. Just to help sort of separate in your minds this idea of the virtual mentor from the virtual persona, or the virtual life coach, the virtual persona. The virtual mentor, we equate to something like the demons in Philip Pullman's books, in the Dark Materials. It's that character that's always with you, it's always providing the best advice. Master Chief was mentioned in the introduction. It's providing good, best practice, consolidated wisdom, very objective information to help you, and providing you with a single point of contact into a whole variety of other information sources. By contrast, the virtual persona, imagine that the headmaster's study in Hogwarts. When Dumbledore has a problem, he has got the portrait of each of the previous headmasters and headmistresses in that room, and he can go up to each of those portraits and he can have a conversation with them to understand how they dealt with that particular problem or what happened in that particular time. The information that he gets back will be very opinionated, it might be wrong, it's going to be very subjective, but by talking to a number of those different portraits, he can then build up enough information for him to then go and make the right decision. So those are the two sort of models that we're trying to look at and investigate through the work we're doing. So the virtual life coach, we've developed it as a mobile chatbot application. We're currently using something called ChatScript, which we found is quite a very flexible and a powerful tool for developing conversational AI systems. And we've got the option if we want to sort of branch into machine learning elements of it, but we're not at the moment. It's very much about providing the triage, so it's about asking the questions and then pointing the person to the other resources that can help. But as I say, the idea is all the time it's doing that, it can be dropping into the conversation questions to prompt the user to find out what their situation is, to find out if they need help in any particular areas. It can cover areas like learning and education, as well as family life type issues, personal life type issues. Military personnel moving around a lot tend to have fairly chaotic lives. There's a lot of questions that they have about how to do things that you'd almost never meet inside a civvy street. And obviously we can flag out to other resources. One thing we were asked to do by MoD Ethics was to make sure we have what we call sort of red flag keywords in there for duty of care issues. So if people did start talking about things like self-harm or suicide, there was an immediate red flag that was raised to human personnel, and the users were briefed on that as part of the introduction to the system. And these are the results we got from our first deployment down at Defence School of Electrical and Mechanical Engineering. To give you an equivalent, it's like an FE college. So these are soldiers and a few service women who've done their basic training. They want to become mechanics and technicians, so they effectively go through doing, I suppose, what will almost be a T-level nowadays. So they spend up to a year doing academic study in terms of learning how to be a mechanic, how to be an electrician or whatever. So they're immediately dumped to an environment they don't really understand. They've got to find their way around the base. They've got to understand some of the norms of the base, but they've also got to get access to information. So it's quite a good place for us to do the trials. You can get some idea of the feedback we got. Big issues around service terminology. We're a bunch of white dudes sat there writing our application, all in a middle age generally, with a few in their sort of mid-20s. You then start giving it to an 18 or a 19-year-old, totally different language, totally different background. So trying to get those users involved as early as we could do so as to understand some of the terminology, some of the slang that they're using, was absolutely vital. With chatbots generally, you find there's, particularly with some commercial ones, there's quite a balance between, do you make this a bot that's very conversational? So can you say almost anything to the bot and it will try and respond? Or do you make it very structured? So almost at every point, there's only, it pops up 2 or 3 options and you get to choose those 2 or 3 options and that's it. And for this one, originally went down a fairly conversational approach. We then just sort of thought, well, hang on, maybe the guys are actually having issues with this. So we went back to them and said, actually, do you want us to stay on this route or do you want us to go down a more menu-based? But they said, no, they like the ability that they could just type a question in and get an answer straight away. They don't have to sort of start navigating menus or trees or anything else like that. Trying to get this balance between sort of motivating content, the stuff that actually is going to get them using the system, as against the hygiene content, the information that's just of use to them sort of as and when they need it, and then this productive content to actually sort of really get to grips with some of the wellbeing issues. Again, trying to get the right balance of that. One of the things we did is we held fortnightly sessions with the students, effectively, asked them what was working and what wasn't working, and basically said to them, well, what would you like the bot to do that isn't currently doing? And each fortnight, we tried to come back with something that they'd said. Like one of the first things they said, you do realise, sir, it's the World Cup this week, don't you? And so by the time we came up with the next release, we had all the World Cup information there, so they could start looking up scores, looking up the fixtures tables and the like. Expectation management generally has always been a problem with chatbots. People have always felt chatbots should be able to do far more than they actually do when you come to use them. Expectations set by science fiction and the media. So trying to set expectations at the beginning. We looked at gamification, so we thought, well, actually, we want people to use different parts of the bots. We'll give them scores based on not just how often are they talking to the bot, but are they trying all the different features out in the system. We found that worked for some people, didn't work for others. And then in terms of actually getting people together, we found pizza was about the only answer. So as long as we turned up to a session with a big box of pizzas, they were quite happy, and they would give us as much feedback as we could possibly want. So that was done under one particular MoD research program. And then about 18 months ago now, MoD came up with something called the Defence People Challenge. So this was Defence People, effectively the HR department for the whole of the military. Basically saying we've got problems in all these areas. We want to see what are the best solutions that industry can offer us to try and improve what we're doing. They weren't after consultancy type stuff or paper-based report. They want people to actually go there, deliver stuff that could be used in the field. And so we were lucky enough to pick up one of the awards through that. So what we're now on to is we're now on to a second stage of the life coach. We're now going to trial it at an RAF base. Those of you who might know RAF Fylingdales, used to be a big set of golf balls. It's now a big pyramid. And a very different audience, far more mature, on operational duties. So they're working shift patterns, which leads to additional stress. Their job is incredibly stressful as well. So a very different sort of set of challenges. And so what we're doing now is we're developing a native mobile app. One of the problems with working with MoD is most of their locations are in the middle of nowhere. So not only has it got to be a mobile app, it's got to work offline. It's no good having one that's reliant on Wi-Fi or wireless or 3G. So the conversational AI has got to work offline on the mobile itself. And then we also need the reporting system so we can understand what people are doing on the system and understand which bits of the system are and aren't being used. And also we wanted to make sure that it was something that we could actually get the staff up there involved in the content creation. So almost all of the systems that you see out there at the moment for developing conversational AI, they tend to be conversational authoring tools. So if you look at IBM Watson, you're typing in, these are the questions that people are going to ask, and then these are the sorts of responses and how I want to manage the responses. So what we wanted to do was move totally away from that. And we did that in basically two ways. The first is where we've got a structure we want to take somebody through, so something what we've called a pathway. So maybe it might be a lesson on well-being. It might just be trying to identify what the right bit of information is. Then what we've got is this pathway editor. You can see a fairly complex pathway there. That's basically just a drag-and-drop environment that lets us drag and drop and create that conversational pathway that we want to. And that is something that we've already got. People who are the managers, if you like, in the organisations are already getting familiar with how to use that. The content specialists are also getting familiar with how to use that, so you don't need to deeply understand conversational AI to do that. The second thing, poorly represented by the bar chart at the bottom, is basically trying to make sure almost all the information in the system is stored within what we call classes, so which are really just types of things. So this is a service, this is a resource, this is an organisation, and then the system knows what sort of information to expect about each of those bits of information. And you as an author, all you have to do is provide it with the information. You don't have to worry about how they're going to ask the question, because if it's something like an opening time, well, there's only sort of one way you ask any question about opening times, or a set of ways. So what we've tried to do is make sure we've got this authoring tool, which means that people with relatively low skill can actually create the content. So talking very briefly about Verge Personas, so this is this idea about trying to create a copy of an individual person. And we were quite keen that what we did was very much seen as sat within the concept of knowledge management. This wasn't necessarily about creating a chatbot, but this was about better understanding how we take some information which is currently implicit knowledge and make it explicit knowledge, and so that can be accessed more readily by the people still in post. And the way we did that is through a knowledge graph. So we're using RDF triples so to store all the information in the system. Again, a bit like I've just mentioned with the life coach, we have this idea of different classes of information, and each of those tends to link to each other. What's important is during the course of the project that's been running for 2.5 years, is we've now got a bot that will totally self-boot. So pretty much you can sit down yourself in front of the blank bot. We can just give you a couple of lines to start with, and then you can just start talking to the bot. And the bot, in a fairly structured way at the moment, will then just start to capture the people you talk about, the organisations you talk about, the projects you talk about, the products you talk about. And every time you mention one of those things, it then knows, okay, that's a person. Right, I need to know this, 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 and this. And it can then start dropping those questions into conversation. And as a final sort of test on this particular project, in 35 hours, we showed we could build about 70 to 80% of all the information we've built into the initial bot that we created. So the task of actually building one of these is not necessarily huge. It's still a long way from perfect, but it's not necessarily something that's insurmountable. And obviously, we can support that by bringing in structured data. So we've showed how we could bring in email information, GPS records, so all of that structured information that somebody is generating as they go about their day-to-day business, and bring that into the system as well. But just as important about how we get information into the system, we're also interested in how do we get information out. And if you look at most human conversation, it's not question, answer, which is what you get with almost every chatbot. Instead, it's you ask somebody a question, and they rabbit on for the next 5 minutes. And hopefully, at some point in that next 5 minutes, they say something that's of use. You say, oh, hang on, what about that? So what we've tried to do is create that sort of conversational capability in the chatbot. And we can do that because we've not got this knowledge graph. So effectively, when you ask the bot a question, it identifies whereabouts in the knowledge graph the answer is, but then it identifies, okay, what's next to that, and what's next to that, and what's next to that. And we can actually set with these things called personality sliders, things like how task-focused, if you like, the bot is. So if it's very task-focused, it'll give you the answer and it'll shut up, particularly if it's also not very talkative. But if you actually say, well, actually, no, this bot likes to rabbit on, then it will start to drift over this knowledge map to quite a large extent. So, and then the final element on this is about anecdote and memory. So not all information is semantic. So the semantic stuff is the projects, the people, the organizations. The anecdotes and the episodic memory is just as important in trying to capture. So it's the stories that people know about, yeah, when we worked with them, we used to go to this pub, XYZ, or yeah, when we actually did this experiment, the guy lied through his teeth about how he was actually capturing the data. So what we've also got within the abilities to capture those relatively verbatim episodic memories from the user as well, but then tie them back into the knowledge graph so they can be accessed in a different way. So the initial trial results of that, so we created something that basically looked like a Skype type interface. So you had a text chat, it was a head and shoulders avatar. One of the big problems at the moment with most head and shoulders avatars, if you want to start using text to speech, is whilst you can create an avatar of almost anybody, there's still only about 8 different English language voice fonts out there commercially available. We tried some of the systems to generate your own voice fonts, but quite honestly, we didn't get a good performance out of those at all in the time we had. For the test, we split it between people who knew the person who was involved and people who knew the subject that the bot or the person knew about. And, you know, whilst I wouldn't set much store in the numbers, we were quite surprised that people rated out of 10, 4.33 as an average about how much the bot resembled the person, not necessarily how it looked, but in terms of the knowledge it had, the way it talked. So I think that was probably a far higher score than we actually anticipated we'd get out of it. And domain knowledge was about 5.7 out of 10. We also use something called Grice's Conversational Maxims. They're very useful if you're working with chatbots. They basically talk about human conversation and how to measure the quality of human conversation. And so we use that to score the bot. We also used it to score the subject. So the subject scored 1.64 in a sample set of data, high score of 2. And the bot at the end was scoring 1.58 out of a high score of 2. So actually not doing too badly. What was interesting, though, is if you look at the question complexity, so apart from assessing the bots, we also assessed the users. And the users were generally asking very complex questions of the poor bot. So you can see there, you know, recommended reading levels well in excess of what it should be doing. US grade 10 sort of education. So people were not being at all lenient with the bot. They were asking quite complex questions of it. And, you know, where we're hoping to get towards is something like this. So it's the idea that there isn't one bot to rule them all, but you've got this sort of virtual life coach that supports the warfighter on a day-to-day basis. And then you need this basically Master Sergeant, Master Chief type AI so as to actually support them within a more like a combat type environment. But each of those bots is accessing a number of other bots to answer questions. But the key thing is that who better to build this virtual persona than the virtual life coach? So if you're talking to a bot on a day-to-day basis to actually go about just doing your day-to-day job, what actually that bot is ideally placed to build up the virtual persona over time, and that virtual persona then feeds back into the system as the persona for somebody else. And just to finish off, as I said at the beginning, one of the reasons for doing this project was to surface a whole load of questions around ethics. And sure enough, you know, they came flooding out about the minute we create one of these personas, then what are the implications? You know, who can draw the pay of the persona? If the persona is performing as well as I am, can I just send the persona to work and I'll stay in bed? If I'm going off on leave, can the company basically clone the persona and use it several times to earn more fees? But the one that I think that really got us all was this one about, well, actually, we've now created a poor copy of this guy. If he gets run over by a bus tomorrow, what happens to that virtual persona? Does the family have right of access to it? Does MoD have continuing rights to use it? And so we really are now sort of into this space of going beyond the virtual persona and into this area that's called digital afterlife or digital immortality. To think we're now beginning to have the capability, however badly, to create these sorts of virtual personas, even if we're not intending to build them to be something that becomes digitally immortal or lives on beyond our death. The fact is, the minute we do die, we have to know what is going to happen to that information and what is going to happen to that persona. And pretty much, I'll leave you with that. And if you're interested in some of the background to what we're doing and some of the underlying technologies, one of my co-researchers and I have published a book at the beginning of the year on virtual humans, available for Amazon and all good booksellers. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time and hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you.